The following story was posted on Reddit, and all credits belong to the original author. Special thanks to the Scarlet Priest for granting me permission to narrate their story. Now then, please listen. I have a story to share. Do enjoy. My father, for as long as I could remember, was afraid of the ocean. He wanted nothing to do with the beach. Even at the mere mention of visiting the beach, he would get agitated and angry. It's not like he was afraid of water, because he had no problem with going to a lake, river, or pool. In fact, he had a large freshwater pond at our house. But it was the ocean that scared him. We lived in a small town in central Pennsylvania, far from the nearest beach. Last year, my father passed away. It was peaceful and painless. After his death, I decided to research on his side of the family. He was an immigrant from Scotland. I know he had parents and a brother, but he never talked about them. My grandparents passed away years ago, but my uncle was still around. I did some digging and found my uncle's phone number. He was still living in Scotland, more specifically, the Orkneys. I had never been to the Orkneys or Europe. I got in contact with my uncle in Scotland. He was thrilled to talk to me. He told me that he hasn't heard from my father in 6 years and asked how he was doing. I told him the grave news, and he was very sad to hear this because he didn't know my father wasn't doing well, and they told me they would have come over to the US to visit. I told him I was hoping to visit the Orkneys to see where my father grew up and do some sightseeing. My uncle eagerly agreed. We made the arrangements, and in 2 weeks, I flew to Scotland. I landed at Inverness Airport in northern Scotland, and I took the ferry to the Orkneys. My uncle was waiting to pick me up. We drove to his house where my aunt and cousins were waiting for me. We had a few glasses of whiskey and reminisced about my father. I had fun talking to them, and wondered why my dad rarely mentioned his side of the family, as nothing about them seemed off. Late into the evening, my uncle brought out an old photo album and went over the pictures. They dated back to at least the 70s. My dad looked so young and happy in all of them. I could see the resemblance between me and him. All the photos seemed normal. There were family photos, birthday and Christmas photos, and pictures with him and his friends. One photo in particular did catch my eye. It was of my father in his teens, on a sailboat out at sea. This made no sense to me because I knew for a fact that my father was scared of the ocean. I pointed this out to my uncle, asking him how they got him onto a boat in the middle of the ocean. My uncle seemed puzzled and asked what I meant. I explained to him my father's fear of the ocean and how he wanted nothing to do with the ocean. My uncle laughed and said that my father loved going out on the ocean and was an avid fisher and sailor. I thought back to my childhood and asking my father if we could go to the beach. He instantly tensed up and gave me a look that conveyed worry and terror. He told me that it was too far and that it's not a good idea. I also remember asking my mom about this fear, and she told me that it was the only thing she couldn't figure out about him. She told me that when they were dating, they drove to a small beach town after a lot of convincing. During the day, my father seemed unbothered when he was on the boardwalk. At night, my mother managed to convince him to take a moonlight walk on the beach. Everything seemed fine for a while, and then suddenly my father stared out into the horizon and then took off running inland. My mother gave pursuit and found him at the car in tears, rocking back and forth, repeating, "It followed me," over and over again. They decided to drive back to the hotel they were staying in. My mom tried to pry my father about what he saw, but he shook his head and refused to say anything, only responding, "If I talk about it, it'll find me again." When they got back to the hotel, my mom told me that my father was on edge the whole night, getting no sleep and constantly looking out the window. The next day, they cut the vacation short and went home. To this day, my mother always respected his wishes to never go to the beach. I continued to flip through the photo album and saw another picture of my father on a fishing pier, shirtless. This picture struck me as odd because I couldn't see the scars he had on his left shoulder. Another thing to note, my father had 3 distinct scars on his shoulder. He had them for as long as I could remember. When I asked him about it, he told me he fell off his bike when he was a kid. But according to this picture, it was evident that he was lying. I asked my uncle about this, and he said that he didn't get them until he was in his early 20s, and that some animal attacked him. I explained the experience my father had with my mother, and how he lied to me about his scars, and how I found all of this so bizarre. My uncle thought for a moment. He then got very somber and told me that the night he was attacked and left for the mainland to stay with extended family, later immigrating to America seemingly out of nowhere. "What happened the night he got attacked?" I asked. My uncle got very serious and finished off his whiskey and poured another glass. "It's not a night I'd like to remember." He took a deep breath. "Your father liked to take walks on the beach at night. He did this for years with no problems at all. He would just clear his head and forget the world. One night, he went out. It was bitter cold in the middle of winter. Your grandfather insisted that he skip his walk that night. Your father just ignored him but bundled up and promised to be back shortly. He was gone for 3 hours. Your grandfather was about to go look for him, but then, seemingly out of nowhere, your father burst into the house screaming bloody murder. His clothes were torn to shreds and he had those 3 gashes on his shoulder. Your father was in hysterics. We couldn't get him to calm down and had no idea what happened. He eventually passed out on the spot. We had a doctor come over, and he told us that he must have been attacked by a stray dog and he was just shaken up. The next day your father left for the mainland, only saying that he couldn't stay here anymore. We let him go, thinking that he needed time away from home and that he would calm down eventually. But we never saw him again. My uncle wiped away a tear. To this day, I don't know what happened to him that night. It can't have been a dog that attacked him. The scratches on his shoulder were from claws or something, and the damage to his coat had to have been from something that had immense strength. I had more questions, but my uncle was visibly upset, so I changed the subject. We spent the rest of the evening just small talking until the alcohol made us drowsy enough to go to bed. That week, my uncle showed me around the islands and took me to the best bars in the UK. We had some great drunken nights together, and I got some great scenic pictures of the islands. I had such a great time that I promised myself that I would make this trip a yearly venture. That was not to be, though. My last night on the Orkneys is when it all became clear. My uncle and I had just gotten back from a bar where we toasted each other in my father's memory. When we got back to my uncle's house, he was pretty drunk and went to bed. I was drunk but very much awake. I decided to go for a walk, around town. I walked up the streets towards the shoreline, even though it was winter and it had rained earlier, giving the air more of a crisp, and found a pathway into the woods. I took the trail following my ears to the sound of the waves. When I got to the beach, I was greeted by cold, salty air and the light of a full moon on the water. I walked down to the beach and saw an old abandoned fishing shack. It was pretty old, the sea breeze chipping away at it for years. A few rusty buckets filled with rainwater were on the outside. I looked at my watch and told myself I would take a brief walk and come back to the fishing shack. I let the environment of the beach absorb me. This was such a unique experience for me since, as a kid, I never had the pleasure of being close to the ocean. I sniffed the air and let the sound of the waves immerse me. I looked out into the ocean, observing the moonlight on the water. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, the atmosphere changed. It went from calm and soothing to bitter cold and malice-filled. I looked at the water and saw something emerge from it. What I saw cannot be explained in the realm of reason. At first glance, I thought it was a man riding a horse, but after a closer examination, I could tell it wasn't human. The thing was a horse-like creature that had the upper body of a man fused to its back. Its face was skeletal, covered in muscle tissue, only missing a nose replaced with a gaping hole. The whole thing was skinless. I could clearly see its muscles pulsing. It had small protrusions of bone all over its body. Its arms dangled at its side, each hand with 3 very long claws. The skeletal face of the man looked at me, and followed by the horse half. The creature then pointed at me with its dangly arms and have an inhuman shriek. This snapped me out of my stupor, and I began to run in the direction of the fishing shack. I thought I had a head start, but then I heard the sound of a horse panting as well as the clump hooves behind me. It was gaining on me. I didn't know if I could outrun it. I then felt my hood being grabbed and I was lifted into the air. The thing held me up and shook me. It brought me closer to the horse face of its body. Its breath smelled like death and decay. Out of impulse, I poked the eyes of the horse and it dropped me. The horse half recoiled and it bucked while the human part of the creature shrieked. I got up and began running again. I knew if it caught me, it would definitely not be kind to me this time. I found the old shack, but the creature was in hot pursuit behind me. I hid in the shack and closed the door, hoping I could wait it out until morning. The creature circled the shack. Each thump of its hooves sent my adrenaline skyrocketing. It began to taunt me verbally, speaking perfect English. Its voice was raspy and ancient. "You were unwise to come back, Alexander." My blood froze. Alexander was my father's name. This creature thought I was my father. The creature kept talking as I stayed still. I do not let slights against me go unpunished, and I don't like it when my hunt gets away from me. My father must have beaten this thing back at some point. But how? I tried to think, but then was interrupted when the creature burst its way into the shack. The horse half drooled with anticipation, while the human half smiled. I back away thinking about what that thing was going to do to me. Then a drop of rainwater landed on its shoulder, and it flinched as if it was hot. I then thought that this thing must be adverse to fresh water. Seizing the opportunity, I grabbed one of the rusted buckets of rainwater and doused the creature with it. It shrieked in pain as the horse half bucked and kicked. I picked up another bucket and doused the human half in the face. It shrieked and curses me. I picked up the last bucket and downed the creature in the horse's face. It roared in pain and anger. I used this distraction and ran around it and exited what was left of the shack. I ran to the woodland path and up the trail back to town with the shrieks of the creature fading behind me. I ran back to my uncle's house. Once inside, I locked the door and broke down. I had no clue what just happened. I didn't sleep. All I did was think about the creature. That must have been the animal Father encountered all those years ago. The next morning I told my uncle everything about the creature and my theory of how it was the same one that attacked my father. My uncle became pale and nodded, saying that it all made sense now. He explained to me that I have encountered the Nukkalavi, an ancient ocean demon that has terrorized the inhabitants of the Orkneys since the Vikings first landed. He told me in the dead of winter, it is known to emerge from the water to attack and kill humans. He then told me that it is adverse to fresh water and that I was right to douse it with rainwater. He told me that if its prey gets away, it feels spurned and will always watch the escaped prey from a distance. He never thought the Nukkalavi was real, thinking it was just an old folk's tale. He told me that I needed to leave the Orkneys and never come back for my own safety. I didn't argue. He drove me to the ferry and dropped me off. As I waved goodbye, I looked up the shore and could have sworn I saw the Nukkalavi watching me, with pure malice in its stare. Today, I live in Arizona, far away from any body of water and still keep in contact with my uncle. My only advice is this: if you visit the beach in the dead of winter, please be careful. You never know when you could become hunted.